The word fascist has become pervasive in American political culture. It is weaponized to shut down dissenting opinions. In today's political culture, anyone who disagrees with woke culture and egalitarian rhetoric is systematically labeled as a right-wing fascist or a Nazi. Fascism and Nazism are associated with right-wing politics, and the left has taken advantage of this misallocation of ideological definition to ascertain its dominance in American political culture. It is important to clarify the definition of fascism and communism and where they stand. Fascism is not a right-wing ideology, it is a left-wing ideology. In fact, fascism and communism are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is collectivism. Fascism and communism are two ideological subsets of collectivism. What is collectivism? Collectivism is a political ideology that prioritizes the group or the community over the individual. Collectivism emphasizes the welfare and goals of the group over those of the individual. The ideological spine of collectivism is egalitarianism. Moreover, the main characteristic of collectivism is that it relies on a central authority, notably the state or a government, to achieve the goals of the group and maintain its welfare. It advocates for centralized power. Under collectivism, the central authority's power is expansive and sometimes absolute. Thus, left-wing politics is based on the ideological framework of collectivism. For example, socialism and communism are two political and economic ideological subsets of collectivism. The very opposite of collectivism is individualism. Indeed, individualism is a political ideology that emphasizes the primary importance, value, and autonomy of the individual over the group or the community. In other words, the welfare and goals of the individuals are more prioritized than those of the group. The essential characteristic of individualism is the limited power of the central authority in the individual's life. Under individualism, the central authority's power is limited to a very small number of functions that are meant to protect the rights of the individual, such as the right to life, liberty, and property. Thus, right-wing politics is based on the ideological framework of individualism. For example, capitalism and civil liberties are two political and economic ideological subsets of individualism. Now that we've dissected the ideological definitions of collectivism and individualism, the main question to ask ourselves is to know why fascism is a left-wing ideology instead of a right-wing one. Fascism is a subset of collectivism and, therefore, a variant of left-wing politics because it believes in two major precepts of collectivism. 1, the prioritization of the group over the individual, and 2, the centralized power of the state or government. Based on these two precepts, fascism cannot be considered a right-wing ideology because the welfare and goals of the individual are undermined at the expense of the welfare of the community embodied by the state. That being said, fascism and communism are not fundamentally different, as they are both subsets of collectivism. They both believe in centralized power and the subversion of individual rights. The main difference between the two, which is rather a distraction than a substantive ideological dichotomy, is that while communism mainly focuses on the economic aspect of egalitarianism, abolition of private property and the redistribution of wealth, fascism focuses on the military aspect of egalitarianism. Communism relies on centralized power to achieve economic goals for the community, whereas fascism relies on centralized power to achieve military goals for the community. It is important to highlight the concept of egalitarianism in both fascism and communism. In communism, egalitarianism is based on the concept of a classless society. As Marx argued, the problem of society was that it was divided into different social classes. Thus, eliminating social classes would create a utopic society where everyone would be thriving equally in a stateless society. The ultimate goal of communism is totalitarian equality in a classless and stateless society. In a fascist society, however, egalitarianism isn't based on the concept of a classless society where everyone would be equal to one another in terms of material goods. On the contrary, fascism rejects egalitarianism in that sense. Fascism believes in hierarchical societies. More importantly, fascism embraces Darwinism. Egalitarianism in a fascist society is based on the concept of total submission of the individual to the state power through the concept of nationalism. Individuals are all equally subject to and submissive to state power and must prioritize nationalism above anything else. Lastly, let us address the issue with Nazism. The word Nazi is constantly thrown around by leftists to shut down dissenting opinions. Let us clarify what Nazism is and why it is a left-wing ideology and not a right-wing one. Nazism is a derivative of fascism. In fact, it is German fascism. The word Nazi comes from National Socialism. If we stick to the etymological definition of Nazism, National Socialism, then a Nazi is nothing else by an individual who believes in socialism and nationalism. A Nazi is a person who holds socialist values when it comes to economics, and nationalist values when it comes to politics and culture. The real difference between Nazism and classical fascism is the racial component. Fascists believe in the glory of the state through war and military conquest. Nazis believe in the very same thing, but for the purpose of racial purification. In other words, while fascists believe in the glory of the state for its own sake, Nazis believe in the same thing, but for the sake of racial purification. The war between Stalin and Hitler during World War II was not an ideological war, since both ideologies, fascism and communism, are based on collectivism. It was a pure political and unnecessary distraction. The root cause of that war was based on pure ego and megalomania. The real ideological war during World War II was Nazi Germany versus the United Kingdom. It was collectivism, represented by Nazism, versus individualism, represented by the UK. If you encounter someone, especially a left-leaning person, calling you fascist or Nazi, just because you don't abide by their socialistic or communistic worldview, remind that person that fascism and communism are like Ishmael and Isaac. They are two ideological brothers who despise each other. A right-leaning person is someone who believes in capitalism, free market economics, property rights, individual rights, and small government. Fascism is not a right-wing political ideology. It is a left-wing ideology, and claiming that fascism is right-wing is simply intellectually dishonest, and it is used as a weapon to shut down dissenting opinions.